So, my talk this morning is entitled Narrative Truth versus Factual Truth on the Dharma Path. Um, Marcel Proust, in 1912, when he wrote Remembrance of Things Past, said, quote, remembrance of things past is not necessarily the remembrance of things as they were. And what he's reminding us there is that we devise stories of our lives from a mixture of and recollections of relationships, parents, children, siblings, experiences, on and on and on. And consequently, these memories are not necessarily factually correct given our biases and our tendencies to spin and color our own stories. You know, especially to avoid being misled by delusions, false narratives, wanting to have things be a certain way, look a certain way. And so contrast that with factual truth. So I'm going to call that first batch narrative truth. I mean, that's what it's called. Factual truth refers to objective reality, the way things actually exist, independent of our subjective perceptions or stories. So, I live in Charlottesville. I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley. I mean, those are factual truths. Okay, they don't get distorted or colored by different biases and so forth. And those facts are verifiable with empirical observation, with evidence, with written records, and so forth. And the Buddha encouraged us to, as you remember, to investigate reality directly through our own experience rather than blindly accepting hearsay, dogma, and so forth. For example, the factual truth is that all compounded phenomenon are impermanent and subject to change and cessation, which is why narrative truth often gets distorted or is distorted because of the law of impermanence. This law of impermanence is an observable reality that we can know directly through careful attention. It's not just a philosophical idea. We can measure it, we can test it, we can generally agree upon it. The number of breaths we take each minute, historical dates of certain things, these are factual truths. And I don't need to tell you that science is largely based on facts. Narrative truth, however, is a different beast. And this is where it really becomes relevant to our practice, because these are the stories that we tell ourselves, about others, about the world, about what happened to us in the past. And these narratives are, by definition, shaped by our emotions, our experiences, our cultural lenses, our families, our communities, on and on. So narrative truth refers to the stories, interpretations, and subjective, there's the word subjective, framings that we construct about reality. And, and they're useful for, making sense of our experiences and communicating ideas. I mean, they're necessary, we have to have them, but we have to be careful in not treating them as though they were factual. They are not factual representations of objective reality. So just a silly example, consider two people who witness a car accident. One might emphasize the screech of the brakes, the other the look on the driver's face. I mean, they both come away with a very different narrative about what they just observed. And then multiply that by the complexity of everything we encounter in our lives, and you can see how narrative truth really, really happens. Our narratives are often comforting. Sometimes they provide a sense of order and meaning in our lives. But that doesn't make them factually true. And I'm not bashing narrative truth here. I'm just saying we need to make this distinction for reasons I'll get into in a couple of minutes. And one of those reasons primarily is that if we cling too tightly to narrative truths, they can cause tremendous suffering. Think of the narrative, I'm not good enough, which leads to self-doubt and questioning ourselves. Think of the narrative of they are the enemy, they are the bad guys. That can influence and fuel our anger and conflict. So So narrative truth is the stuff I refer to whenever I talk about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves in the world in which we live. And remember that when we talk about who we are and all the stories we have acquired about who we are as individuals, they're just stories. It is a narrative. The good news is that the Dharma offers us guidance on dealing with these narrative truths and seeing them more clearly. Doesn't mean we get rid of them. We just see them as narrative truths, not factual truths. You know, all spiritual teachings, and certainly including the Buddhist discourses, involve some degree of narrative framing and sort of artistic license to convey deeper truths. This is the whole notion of metaphor in the Sanghas. You know, the stories of the Buddha's life, for instance, while based on historical events, have been shaped by centuries of oral tradition before it was written down. So we know there's lots of spin going on there, lots of shading, lots of interpretation. And similarly, these metaphysical concepts that show up in Buddhist teachings, like rebirth and karma, are narratives aimed at describing patterns of reality, not literal facts. Okay, they're ways of framing experience. So the important point here is that the Buddha taught us to see things as they are, not as we perceive them through our stories, our own mental filters. Now, that doesn't mean we don't carry the narrative stories around and so forth, but we see them for what they are and we don't become overly identified with them. So, with our practice, we observe our thoughts and narratives without judgment, but we don't necessarily buy into them and think that they're the final word on any topic. We see how they arise, how they color our perception, and more importantly, how they can often lead us astray or lead us down an unwholesome path. And it doesn't mean we discard them again, but what we use our practice to, like a map, to navigate through them. But we remember that it's not the territory itself. It's just part of the journey. We don't take it as the territory. Too often we mistake narrative truth for factual truth and think that they are one and the same. And this is always a challenge when I was in practice for therapists to help folks see that distinction. People come in with narrative truth thinking it's the final word on who they are, who their what their personality is. So that's part of therapy, is always helping folks separate factual truth of their lives from the narrative truth that they've accumulated, especially when it's unflattering, derogatory, negative, and so forth. So, with that said, what are some of the practices, and these are familiar themes, that help us make that discrimination so that we have the ability to see our stories as stories and not as factual history? Obviously, mindfulness. We pay attention to our thoughts and emotions, but we don't get caught up in the stories. You know, when we do our guided practice, I'll often say, just watch what arises, but see that as a story. Don't become overly identified with it. As I often say, just see it as clouds drifting across the sky. We use self-inquiry. We talked about discernment on Wednesday, where we question our narratives. You know, what's the basis of this? Is it fact? Is it fear? Is it trying to fit in? You know, do they serve us or do they hinder our progress on the path? Next is compassion for self and others. You know, recognize that others too live within their own narratives, and often that colors their behavior with us and toward us. And so we try to approach that with understanding rather than judgment. Oh, you're bad. Well, maybe it's coming from that person's narrative. You know, so as we employ discernment and cultivate wisdom, which I'm going to talk in more detail about on Wednesday, we learn to discern factual truth from our own narratives. It's a pretty clear point of demarcation when we start to pay attention to it. We see, you know, what's factual and what's colored with all of our history and so forth. And what this does, it allows us or gives us a greater agency to respond to situations skillfully, free from these distortions of self-created stories. Our practice is not about finding the one true story about our lives, even if that existed, and I don't believe there is such a thing. So rather it is about letting go of this rigid identification with our stories. We think our stories are who we are, but in the space of greater awareness and spaciousness, we see that there's a truth, an ultimate truth that transcends these stories, these narratives. And it's the truth of interconnectedness, compassion, and the ever-present possibility of reduced suffering. The Buddha cautioned us against clinging too tightly to any views or narratives as absolute truths. He encouraged us to hold these stories and these narratives lightly, be willing to update them based upon deeper investigation and understanding. As we penetrate into the stories, we begin to see that they're just that. They're not the truth of our experience or the truth of who we are. Because when we confuse narratives with facts, it can lead to things like dogmatism, rigidity, conflict, um, unwholesome belief systems, disconnection from seeing things as they really are, all of which results in increased suffering. And at the same time, though, the Buddha did not dismiss narrative truth as useless. He said, treat it like metaphors. As we do with the suttas, is not factually true, but providing wisdom and insight. Skillful narratives can provide insight, guidance, and meaning when we understand them as skillful rather than depictions of literal reality. Okay, we need to see them for what they are. So the key is to approach the teachings and our experience with an open, discerning mind the discerning mind we talked about on Wednesday, testing them against our direct experience, letting go of any that prove limited or contradictory. Because ultimately, the Buddha's teachings point us toward liberating wisdom that transcends all narratives. By seeing things as they truly are, free from the distortions of these subjective narratives. Every one of us has a different story. Everyone has a subjective narrative, and we too often treat it as though it were factually true. But by beginning to penetrate that, we find peace and freedom with reduced suffering. So our narratives can be a powerful means to an end when we approach them with care and discernment and see them as stories and not as facts. So that is narrative versus factual truth. So let me do this real quick.